Every time an artist walked out of a recording studio, something happened that almost nobody talked about. The music that was released went to the stores. Everything else disappeared behind a locked door, and the artist who made it had no key. This is not a story about a building that burned. It's about who controls the history of music and how that control was written into a single sentence before most of these artists ever set foot in a studio. Imagine finishing the best album of your career. You spend months in the studio. You hand over the tapes. The label says, "No, now what?" You can't release it independently. You can't retrieve the tapes. You have no legal standing because buried in the contract you signed was a provision that assigned ownership of the master recording to the label. Not a share, not a license, the master, in perpetuity. The vault was not a room. It was a legal system with walls. And ownership wasn't just the right to control music, it was the right to decide when history would hear it. Decades later, that right would determine what survived a fire. Once that ownership provision became standard across the major labels, the vaults began to grow. Every recording session left something behind. Every second of it belonged to someone else. Alternate takes, finished songs, sometimes entire albums. The public only ever heard a fraction of what had been recorded. The vault wasn't built to preserve history, it was built to control it. And eventually, that control started swallowing finished albums. Brian Wilson completed Smile. The sessions at Capitol Records in 1966 and 67 produced finished recordings, documented in session logs that are now public. The label's position shifted. Wilson's mental state deteriorated. The record was never issued. The tapes went into Capitol's vault. 44 years passed. Then the world finally heard them. When the Smile sessions were released in 2011, the documentation was unambiguous. The recordings were not incomplete, they were held. This is the first thing the ownership provision meant in practice. A finished album could disappear, not because it failed, because someone else controlled the timing. Bob Dylan delivered a finished Blood on the Tracks to Columbia Records in 1974. Columbia kept the original sessions, filed them, and released a re-recorded version instead in January 1975. The original recordings surfaced on the bootleg series nearly 5 decades later. 2 complete versions of the same record existed simultaneously. One in stores, one in a vault. Columbia didn't lose that album. They decided when the world was ready to hear it, which reveals the second thing the provision meant. The vault was not an archive. It was a clock. The label set the hands, the artist waited outside, music ages, contracts don't. Prince understood what that system produced, and he spent his life building an answer to it. He wasn't fighting for money, he was fighting for the right to decide when and whether anyone would ever hear his music. At Paisley Park in Chanhassen, Minnesota, Prince maintained a personal archive estimated at thousands of recordings, fully produced, demo form, everything in between. Alan Leeds, his former tour manager and label president, confirmed after Prince's death that this was not the residue of prolific recording. It was a strategy. Prince recorded constantly and released selectively, and the 2 activities were managed as entirely separate decisions. He had earned that control the hard way. In 1993, Prince appeared at the Brit Awards with the word "slave" written on his face. He changed his name to an unpronounceable symbol. His position was direct. Warner Brothers held his masters. They controlled when and whether his recordings reached the public, independently of anything he wanted. He spent years trying to escape it. He owned the door. He kept the key. Then he died. The recordings existed. Prince controlled their release, and then he was gone. The estate reported thousands of unreleased recordings with no authoritative inventory, no release plan, no clarity on what he had intended. What had been a deliberate architecture became an administrative crisis overnight. The vault he built to protect his work is still not fully catalogued. The third thing the system produced, the thing nobody in the industry discussed openly, is this: the rights outlive the person who created the work. The label doesn't just control the music, it controls when the music exists for the world. At all. For 70 years, The vaults filled then. One morning, 70 years of accumulated time met a single spark. On June 1st, 2008, a fire broke out on the Universal Studios backlot in Los Angeles. The official statement was measured: a prop building, a contained incident. Some archive material affected. That version held for 11 years. 11 years later, journalist Jody Rosen obtained internal Universal Music Group documents. He opened them. The official story collapsed. An estimated 500,000 master recordings had been stored in a vault beneath a filming location on the backlot. Tapes inherited from the full catalog Universal had absorbed through decades of acquisitions, including MCA, Decca, Motown, and the Polygram Library. First-generation masters, original sessions, recordings for which no artist held a backup copy, because the ownership provision meant the artists had never held rights to them in the first place. Nirvana, Tom Petty, Soundgarden, Elton John, Eric Clapton, REM first-generation masters, gone. Universal had sent letters to affected artists after the fire. Those letters had not accurately described the losses. The full scope had been known since the morning it happened. Here is the detail that reframes everything that came before. The artists who lost recordings in that fire had no copies, because they had never been permitted to keep them. The provision that assigned master ownership to the label was the same provision that left those artists with no insurance, no backup, no legal standing to demand that recordings they had made be protected. The system that accumulated the music was the same system that failed to protect it. The fire didn't create the problem, it made the problem impossible to ignore. If you've never seen this channel before, this is what we do. We take the things about rock that everyone thinks they understand, and we show you how they actually worked. Subscribe if that's what you're here for. Ownership determines control. Control determines timing. And streaming changed what timing was worth. By 2022, catalog music, recordings more than 18 months old, accounted for more than 70% of total music consumption in the United States. Material held as a future option was now immediately monetizable, per stream, at scale. The vault had become the most valuable part of the catalog. Every unreleased song tells two stories, one about music, one about when someone decided that the world was allowed to hear it. The industry finally had a financial reason to open the doors. Authorized release programs expanded across every major estate. Posthumous catalogs were excavated, documented, and issued in not as acts of preservation, but as revenue streams the streaming model had made newly viable. But there was only one legal way to actually beat the system. Taylor Swift used it. When her masters were acquired through a label sale in 2019, Swift did not negotiate. She announced she would re-record her first 6 albums from the ground up, producing new recordings that she would own, and release them in direct commercial competition with the originals. She was not recovering her recordings. She was replacing them. The contract still owned the originals. Her audience didn't have to. Fearless, Red, Speak Now, 1989. Each new version designed to make the original masters commercially redundant. The only recordings she controlled, the only versions whose timing she decided. The artists made the music. The labels held the clock. Swift found the one door the language of the contract hadn't locked. She walked back in and made it all again. In November 2023, the Beatles released Now and Then, a John Lennon home demo from the 1970s. A cassette tape, a vocal buried in noise, that no technology of its era could cleanly separate from the deterioration around it. The process that finally made it audible was developed during the production of Peter Jackson's Get Back documentary. Tools trained to isolate individual voices from damaged analog recordings. The technology did not exist when the tape was made. Paul McCartney called it the last Beatles song. The recording had been sitting in an archive for nearly 50 years, waiting for the world to finally catch up. That is what the vault actually contains. Not the unfinished, not the inferior, recordings that existed in full, waiting for a technology, a legal resolution, a commercial window, or someone willing to act. Some of them are still waiting. The artist recorded the music, Ownership decided when history would hear it.